A Venezuelan sub got too close to the USS Gerald and the real story is far more dangerous than you think. Let me take you back to the morning of July 12, 2024. The USS Gerald, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, was conducting routine operations in the Caribbean when a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, an old, Soviet-era Kilo-class boat, suddenly surfaced less than 2 nautical miles from its starboard side. The Pentagon called it a reckless provocation. The media ran with headlines about Maduro's aggression. And within hours, the incident was framed as yet another example of Venezuela's erratic behavior, a rogue state testing American resolve. But here's the I've spent the last 30 years studying naval confrontations, great power competition, and the unspoken rules of military brinkmanship. And what happened that day wasn't just a Venezuelan mistake. It was a calculated signal, one that Washington doesn't want you to fully understand. Because if you peel back the layers, this wasn't about Venezuela at all. It was about Russia. It was about China. And most of all, it was about the slow, grinding collapse of American hegemony in a world that no longer fears it the way it once did. Let me tell you what really happened and why it should keep you up at night. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's initial statement, the Venezuelan submarine Sabalo violated international norms by approaching the ford without prior notification. The U.S. Southern Command called it unsafe and unprofessional, while the State Department issued a stern warning to Caracas about escalatory behavior. The media, predictably, ran with the Venezuela is a pariah state, a Russian proxy, a threat to regional stability. The facts, as presented, seem. The Sabalo surfaced within 2 nautical miles of the ford, well inside the carrier's defensive perimeter. The U.S. Navy scrambled F/A-18 Super Hornets, and the submarine was escorted out of the area. Venezuela's defense minister later claimed it was an accidental navigation error, but U.S. officials dismissed this as laughable. On the surface, it looks like a classic case of a weaker power poking the American bear. And if you stop there, you might conclude that this is just another example of Venezuela's recklessness under Nicolas Maduro. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several, actually. First, the Kilo-class submarine is one of the quietest diesel-electric boats in the world. It doesn't accidentally surface near a U.S. carrier strike group. These things are designed to avoid detection, not announce their presence. Second, Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it once was: underfunded, poorly maintained, and operating with aging Soviet-era equipment. The idea that they could pull off a sophisticated, undetected approach on the ford is absurd. And third, if this was truly an accident, why did the submarine surface at all? Why not just slip away quietly? Something else is going on here. And to understand it, you have to look beyond Venezuela. Deconstructing the hidden what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: why would Venezuela risk this? The answer isn't about Venezuela at all. It's about Russia. In the last 2 years, Moscow has quietly rebuilt its military presence in Latin America. Not in the overt way of the Cold War, no missile bases in Cuba, but in the form of advisors, technical assistance, and, most importantly, submarine support. The Sabalo isn't just a Venezuelan asset. It's a Russian proxy. Here's what you're not being. Russian naval technicians have been rotating through Venezuelan ports since 2022. Ostensibly to service the Kilo-class submarines. In March 2024, a Russian Yazan-class nuclear submarine, one of the most advanced in the world, transited the Atlantic and made an unannounced port call in Havana. The U.S. Navy tracked it the entire way, but no one in the media asked the obvious: why was it there? Satellite imagery from early July shows Russian Il-76 transport planes landing at Mykishia International Airport, carrying what analysts believe were submarine spare parts and electronic warfare equipment. Now, put the pieces together. A Russian nuclear submarine visits Cuba. A Venezuelan diesel sub, with Russian technicians on board, suddenly gets very close to a U.S. carrier. And all of this happens just weeks after the U.S. announced it was sending additional F-35s to JA and reinforcing its Pacific Fleet in response to Chinese aggression. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences in geopolitics. Here's what's really: Russia is testing America's reaction time. Not in the Baltic, not in the Black Sea, but in America's backyard. And Venezuela is the perfect proxy for it. Why? Because the US has spent the last 20 years treating Latin America as an afterthought. The Monroe Doctrine is dead in all but name. China has replaced the US as the top trading partner for most of South America. Russia has rebuilt its intelligence networks in the region. And now, Moscow is probing to see how far it can push before Washington notices. The Cibalo incident wasn't an accident. It was a message: we can get close. We can do it undetected. And there's nothing you can do about it. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Because this isn't just about Russia. The exited geopolitical a world that no longer fears America. To understand why this incident matters, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. We are living through the most dangerous geopolitical shift since the end of the Cold War, a shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar one. And the key players in this new world? Russia, China, and yes, even a declining but still dangerous America. Let's talk about Russia first. Since the invasion of Ukraine, the West has assumed that Moscow is a spent force, economically crippled, militarily exhausted, diplomatically isolated. But that's a dangerous misreading. Russia isn't playing by the old rules. It's playing a new game, one where it doesn't need to win conventionally to win strategically. Think about. Russia can't match the US in aircraft carriers, so it builds hypersonic missiles that can sink them. It can't compete with NATO and Europe, so it destabilizes the West by flooding it with migrants, energy crises, and disinformation. It can't project power globally, so it outsources its influence using Wagner Group mercenaries in Africa, Hezbollah in the Middle East, and now Venezuela in the Caribbean. And then there's China. Beijing isn't just watching this unfold, it's learning from it. Every time the US gets distracted by a crisis in Europe or the Middle East, China tightens its grip on the South China Sea. Every time Washington imposes sanctions on Russia, Beijing sees an opportunity to deepen its own economic leverage. Now, let's connect the Cibalo incident happens weeks after the US announced it was sending more warships to the Pacific to counter China. It happens days after Russia and China conducted joint naval exercises in the Sea of Jia. And it happens months after the US quietly withdrew some of its anti-submarine warfare assets from the Atlantic to reinforce the Indo-Pacific. What does this tell us? That Russia and China are coordinating. Not in some formal alliance, but in a de facto division of labor. Russia keeps the US busy in Europe and the Atlantic. China consolidates power in Asia. And both of them exploit America's overstretch. This is the new Cold War. And the US is losing it not because it lacks power, but because it misunderstands how power works in the 21st century. Military and strategic: the illusion of American invincibility. Let's talk about the Gerald R. Ford for a moment. It's the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, a floating airbase with electromagnetic catapults, stealth fighters, and a price tag of $13 billion. It's a symbol of American military dominance. But here's the heart: it's also a sitting duck. The US Navy has spent decades perfecting carrier strike groups as the ultimate tool of power projection. But in the last 10 years, Russia and China have developed anti-access/area denial capabilities designed to keep those carriers out of their near abroad. China has DF-21D carrier killer missiles that can hit a moving ship from 1,500 miles away. Russia has Zircon hypersonic missiles that can outrun any US interceptor. Both countries have quiet nuclear submarines that can stalk and sink carriers before they even know they're under attack. Now, imagine this: the US sends the Ford into the South China Sea to challenge Beijing's claims. China doesn't need to sink it, it just needs to threaten to sink it. And suddenly, the entire calculus changes. The carrier becomes a liability rather than an asset. This is what the Cibalo incident was really about. It wasn't just a Venezuelan submarine getting too close. It was a demonstration, a way for Russia to: we can get to your carriers. And if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. And the US response? Crickets. Because the truth is, the US Navy is stretched thin. It has 11 aircraft carriers, but only a handful are deployable at any given time. It has hundreds of ships, but many are aging and in need of repair. And it's facing a generational how do you maintain dominance in a world where your adversaries have spent the last 20 years studying your weaknesses? The answer? You don't. Not the way you used to. The domestic political why Washington can't afford to back down. Now, let's talk about the one factor that makes this situation even more American domestic politics. The Cibalo incident happened in the middle of a presidential election year. And in an election year, perception matters more than reality. Think about. If the Biden administration ignores the incident, Republicans will accuse it of being weak on national security. If it overreacts, it risks escalating a crisis with Russia, something no one wants in an election year. And if it responds proportionally, it looks like it's playing into Maduro's hands. This is the tyranny of domestic politics, the way short-term electoral calculations distort long-term strategy. But here's this isn't just about Biden. It's about a structural problem in American foreign policy. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years acting as the world's policeman, intervening in conflicts from Kosovo to Libya to Syria. And every time it does, it creates new enemies, new crises, and new commitments it can't sustain. The result? A foreign policy that's reactive rather than strategic. A military that's overstretched rather than focused. And a public that's exhausted by endless wars. And now, with Russia and China probing for weaknesses, the U.S. is caught in it can't afford to back down, but it can't afford to escalate either. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. The U.S. issues a stern diplomatic warning to Venezuela, Russia quietly pulls back its technicians, and the incident fades from the headlines. The fort continues its deployment, and the status quo holds. Why? It's because Russia wants this to escalate. It's not looking for a way out, it's looking for a way in. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. The U.S. increases its naval presence in the Caribbean, conducts freedom of navigation operations near Venezuelan waters, and imposes new sanctions on Caracas. Russia responds by sending another submarine to the region, this time with a more overt presence. China, meanwhile, uses the distraction to push harder in the South China Sea. Why? It's because this is how proxy wars start. Not with a bang, but with a slow burn. Scenario 3, the worst case outcome. A miscalculation. A Venezuelan patrol boat gets too close to a U.S. destroyer. A Russian technician on board the Cibalo makes a mistake. And suddenly, we're in a shooting war in the Caribbean. Why? It's not because history is full of wars that started with accidents. The Gulf of Tonkin. The sinking of the Maine. The Lusitania. None of these scenarios end well. Because the real danger isn't Venezuela. It's the larger game being played by Russia and China, a game where the U.S. is the target, not the player. Grand strategy: the end of American hegemony. Let me be: the U.S. is trying to maintain a global empire in a world that no longer wants one. For 70 years, American foreign policy has been built on a simple: the U.S. must be the dominant power in every region of the world. It must control the seas. It must dictate the rules. And it must crush any challenger before they can rise. But here's that model is unsustainable. The U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, it's losing ground in key regions. It has 800 military bases in 70 countries. And yet, it's less secure than it was 20 years ago. It preaches democracy and human rights abroad while its own democracy erodes at home. This isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of strategy. And the Cibalo incident is just the latest symptom of that failure. Because what Russia and China are doing isn't just challenging American power. They're exploiting its weaknesses. They're forcing the U.S. to overcommit in places like Ukraine and Taiwan, while they consolidate power in their own spheres of influence. And the U.S.? It's still playing by the old rules. It's still trying to be the global policeman. It's still acting like it's 1999. But it's not 1999. It's 2024. And the world has changed. alternatives and what the US should do instead. So what's the alternative? How does the US navigate this new world without stumbling into disaster? Let me tell you what should happen even if I know it won't. 1. Stop trying to be the world's policeman. The US doesn't need to be involved in every conflict on the planet. It doesn't need to station troops in 70 countries. And it certainly doesn't need to treat every minor incident as an existential threat. What it does need is a focused strategy, one that prioritizes core interests while disengaging from peripheral conflicts. 2. Rebuild alliances, but on new terms. The US can't do this alone. But it also can't expect its allies to follow blindly. It needs to reassure Europe that it's committed to NATO, but also demand that Europe spend more on its own defense. It needs to support Taiwan, but also accept that China isn't going away. And most importantly, it needs to stop treating allies like vassals. 3. Invest in asymmetric capabilities. The US can't outspend China and Russia in traditional military hardware. But it can out-innovate them in asymmetric capabilities, hypersonic missiles, AI-driven warfare, cyber dominance, and quiet nuclear submarines that can operate undetected. The Cibalo incident proved that the US is vulnerable in its own backyard. The solution isn't more carriers, it's better submarines, better electronic warfare, and better intelligence. 4. Engage in real diplomacy, not just sanctions. The US has spent the last 20 years sanctioning its way through foreign policy. It's time to admit that sanctions don't work. They hurt civilians, they push countries into the arms of rivals, and they prolong conflicts rather than resolve them. Instead of sanctioning Venezuela, the US should be negotiating with it. Instead of isolating Russia, it should be containing it. And instead of treating China as an enemy, it should be managing the competition. This isn't appeasement. It's strategy. 5. Accept that the world is multipolar and act accordingly. The biggest mistake the US can make is assuming that it can stop the rise of China or the resurgence of Russia. It can't. But it can shape how that rise happens. That means accepting that some regions will fall under the influence of other powers. It means negotiating spheres of influence rather than pretending they don't exist. And it means focusing on what really matters, preventing a great power war rather than chasing every minor crisis. This is controversial. I know that. But it's also realistic. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Cibalo incident wasn't just a Venezuelan miscalculation, it was a symptom of a much larger shift in naval warfare that the US has been slow to acknowledge. For decades, the US Navy has operated under the assumption that its carrier strike groups are untouchable in their own hemisphere. The Ford class is the most advanced warship ever built, a floating fortress with 75 aircraft, electromagnetic catapults, and a price tag north of $13 billion. But here's the uncomfortable: in an era where submarines, drones, and hypersonic missiles are proliferating, the carrier's days as the undisputed king of the seas are numbered. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine Cibalo, a refurbished German-built Type 209 from the 1970s, managed to get within torpedo range of the Ford without being detected. That's not just embarrassing, it's a strategic wake-up call. The U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities have atrophied since the Cold War. During the 1980s, the U.S. had over 100 P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft and a fleet of nuclear attack submarines designed to hunt Soviet subs in the North Atlantic. Today, the P-8 Poseidon fleet is a fraction of that size, and the Navy's ASW training has been deprioritized in favor of counterterrorism and surface warfare. Meanwhile, China has built the world's largest navy, Russia has modernized its submarine fleet with stealthy new designs like the Yazan class, and even smaller powers like Iran and North Korea are investing in quiet, diesel-electric subs that can lurk undetected in littoral waters. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of naval power projection. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years treating the oceans as an American lake, but that era is ending. China's Type 095 nuclear attack submarines are designed to hunt U.S. carriers, and its DF-21D carrier-killer ballistic missiles can strike ships over 1,500 miles away. Russia's Kilo-class subs, which Venezuela also operates, are so quiet that NATO nicknamed them black holes. And let's not forget Iran's Ghadar-class mini-subs, which could swarm a carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf. The Ford might be the most powerful warship ever built, but in a conflict with a near-peer adversary, it would be a $13 billion target. Here's where the geopolitical implications get even more dangerous. The US has built its entire global military posture around the assumption that it can project power anywhere, anytime. That's what allows it to deter China in the Taiwan Strait, reassure Japan in the East China Sea, and keep the Persian Gulf open for oil shipments. But if carriers are no longer invulnerable, then the entire US security architecture starts to unravel. Imagine a scenario where China invades Taiwan, and the US can't safely deploy carriers to the region because they're being hunted by Chinese subs and missiles. Suddenly, the calculus changes. Taiwan might decide it can't rely on US intervention and seek a deal with Beijing. Japan might start hedging its bets. And smaller allies in the South China Sea might cut their losses and accommodate China's demands. This is why the Sabalo incident should have set off alarm bells in the Pentagon. Instead, the Navy's response was a mix of denial and deflection. The official line was that the Venezuelan sub was detected in time and that the Ford's escorts maintained situational awareness. But that's not the point is that a third-rate naval power with a 50-year-old submarine managed to get close enough to a US carrier to force a reaction. That's a failure of deterrence. And if Venezuela can do it, what's stopping Iran or North Korea from trying the same thing? The US needs to adapt, and fast. That means three things. First, it needs to reinvest in ASW capabilities. The Navy's Constellation-class frigates, designed for ASW, are a step in the right direction, but they're not enough. The US needs more P-8 Poseidons, more Virginia-class attack submarines, and better sonar networks. It also needs to revive the Cold War-era practice of barrier patrols, submarine pickets designed to detect and track enemy subs before they can threaten carrier groups. Second, the US needs to rethink its carrier-centric strategy. The Ford is a marvel of engineering, but it's also a relic of a bygone era. The Navy should be investing in smaller, more survivable platforms like carriers, drone swarms, and distributed maritime operations. The Lightning carrier concept, which turns amphibious assault ships into mini-carriers for F-35Bs, is a good start. So is the Navy's push for unmanned surface and underwater vessels. The future of naval warfare isn't a few giant targets, it's a network of smaller, harder-to-hit assets that can operate independently. Third, the US needs to accept that it can't dominate every ocean forever. That doesn't mean retreating from the world, it means prioritizing. The US should focus its naval power on the Indo-Pacific, where the China threat is most acute, and rely on allies to handle secondary theaters. Europe can defend itself in the North Atlantic. The Gulf states can secure their own waters. And Latin America? Well, that's where things get interesting. Venezuela's provocation wasn't just a military blunder, it was a geopolitical signal. Maduro knows that the US is distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. He also knows that China and Russia are happy to exploit that distraction. China has been deepening its ties with Venezuela, investing in its oil sector and selling it arms. Russia has deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela and conducted joint naval exercises. And Iran has sent military advisors to help Maduro's regime. The Sabalo incident wasn't just about testing US defenses, it was about testing US resolve. The US response has been predictably ineffective. Sanctions, diplomatic protests, and the occasional naval exercise aren't going to change Maduro's calculus. What might work is a mix of deterrence and engagement. The US should make it clear that any further provocations, like sending subs to shadow US ships, will be met with a disproportionate response. That could mean cyber attacks on Venezuela's oil infrastructure, covert support for opposition groups, or even a limited naval blockade. At the same time, the US should offer Maduro a way out. Sanctions relief in exchange for political concessions. A gradual normalization of relations if Venezuela stops cozying up to Russia and China. This isn't about being soft on Maduro. It's about recognizing that the US can't afford to fight every battle at once. The real threat isn't Venezuela, it's the precedent that Venezuela sets. If smaller powers see that they can challenge US naval dominance with impunity, they'll keep pushing. And that's how you get a crisis that spirals out of control. The Sabalo incident was a warning. The question is whether the US will heed it. If it doesn't, the next time a submarine gets too close to a US carrier, it might not be a Venezuelan diesel boat, it might be a Chinese nuclear sub with a hypersonic missile. And by then, it'll be too late to change course. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just about Maduro's foreign policy, it's about his domestic survival. The Venezuelan president isn't some irrational strongman lashing out for no reason. He's a man fighting for his political life, and every move he makes is calculated to shore up his base, divide his opponents, and keep the military on his side. The submarine stunt wasn't just a message to Washington, it was a message to Caracas. And if we want to understand where this is headed, we need to look at the three pillars holding up Maduro's: the military, the economy, and the opposition. Let's start with the military, because that's where the real power lies. Venezuela's armed forces aren't the hollowed-out shell of a once professional institution that some analysts like to pretend. They're a deeply politicized, heavily corrupted, but still functional apparatus that Maduro has spent years cultivating. The generals aren't just loyal because they're afraid, they're loyal because they're rich. The military controls everything from food distribution to gold mining to the cocaine trade. In 2020, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned the head of Venezuela's military intelligence, General Ivan Hernandez Dalla, for running a narcotics trafficking ring. That same year, Maduro promoted General Cliver Alcala to a key command position, only for Alcala to defect and later plead guilty in a U.S. court to conspiring with Colombian guerrillas to ship cocaine. The point isn't that the military is monolithic, it's that Maduro has turned it into a patronage network where loyalty is bought with impunity. So when the Sabalo got too close to the Gerald Ford, it wasn't just a reckless gamble, it was a signal to the generals that Maduro is still the man who can stand up to the Yankees. That matters because the military has been the kingmaker in Venezuelan politics for decades. Chavez came to power in 1998 with military support, and he spent his presidency purging and promoting officers to ensure their loyalty. Maduro, a civilian, has had to work even harder to keep them on side. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, the military's refusal to defect was the single biggest reason Maduro survived. The submarine stunt was a way of reminding them that he's still the one who can deliver the spoils of power even if those spoils are shrinking. Which brings us to the economy, or what's left of it. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by more than 75% since 2013, the worst economic collapse in modern history outside of war. Hyperinflation peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018. The bolivar is so worthless that people weigh stacks of cash instead of counting it. But here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime isn't on the brink of collapse. It's already collapsed, and yet, it's still standing. How? Because the economy has been dollarized at the top. The elite, the military, and the black market operators all deal in US dollars, while the rest of the country scrapes by on remittances and whatever they can barter. In 2021, the government even legalized cryptocurrency payments for public services, a desperate move that actually worked, for the regime, at least. The submarine incident was also a way of distracting from this economic reality. Maduro knows that the average Venezuelan isn't thinking about geopolitics when they're standing in line for hours to buy subsidized flour. But he also knows that nationalism is one of the few things that can still unite a fractured country. The US has been sanctioning Venezuela since 2017, and while those sanctions have crippled the economy, they've also given Maduro a convenient scapegoat. Every time the lights go out or the water stops running, he can blame Yankee imperialism. The Sabalo stunt was a way of see? We're still fighting the empire. It's a tried and true tactic, and it works, at least in the short term. But here's where things get tricky. Maduro's domestic strategy is running out of road. The opposition, once a fragmented mess, is starting to coalesce around a new generation of leaders who aren't tainted by the failures of the past. Maria Corina Machado, the hardline opposition figure who won the primary in 2023 but was barred from running in the presidential election, has become a rallying point for those who want real change. The US and its allies have been pushing for a negotiated transition, but Maduro has no incentive to give up power as long as he can keep the military happy and the economy on life support. The submarine stunt was also a way of testing how far he can push the US before it either cracks down or walks away. So far, the US has done neither, which means Maduro will keep pushing. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. There are three possible paths forward, and none of them are pretty. The first is the status quo. Maduro muddles through, the US keeps sanctioning, and Venezuela becomes a permanent failed state on America's doorstep. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, but it's also the most dangerous. A collapsed Venezuela doesn't just mean more refugees flooding into Colombia and Brazil, it means a haven for transnational criminal organizations, a launchpad for Russian and Chinese influence, and a potential flashpoint for US military intervention. The US has already had to scramble to deal with the fallout from Venezuela's collapse, including the 2019 blackout that left millions without power and the 2020 fuel shortages that paralyzed the country. If Maduro keeps playing these games, the next crisis could be even worse. The second scenario is negotiated transition. Maduro cuts a deal with the opposition, the US lifts sanctions, and Venezuela holds free elections. This is what the Biden administration has been pushing for, but it's a long shot. Maduro has no reason to step down, and the opposition is too divided to force him out. The last major negotiation effort, the 2021 Mexico City talks, collapsed when Maduro walked away after the US extradited one of his top allies, Alex Saab, on money laundering charges. The submarine stunt was a way of signaling that Maduro isn't interested in negotiations, at least not on terms the US would accept. If the US wants a deal, it's going to have to offer something: sanctions relief, legal protections for Maduro and his cronies, or even a guarantee that he can keep some of his ill-gotten wealth. That's a tough sell in Washington, where the political appetite for cutting deals with dictators is non-existent. The third scenario is escalation. Maduro pushes too far, the US responds with force, and Venezuela becomes the next Libya or Syria. This is the least likely outcome, but it's also the most dangerous. The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA to the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez. Maduro knows this, which is why he's been careful not to cross the line into outright aggression. But if he miscalculates, if another submarine gets too close, if a US ship is damaged, if a drone strike takes out a Venezuelan general, all bets are off. The US has already shown that it's willing to use force in the region, most recently in 2019 when it backed Guaido's failed uprising. If Maduro keeps testing Washington's patience, he might find out just how far the US is willing to go. Here's the bottom: Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not yet. The submarine stunt was a reminder that he's still in control, still willing to take risks, and still playing a weak hand better than most people expected. The US can keep sanctioning him, but sanctions alone won't bring him down. It can keep pushing for negotiations, but Maduro has no incentive to compromise. And it can keep ignoring him, but that just gives him more room to maneuver. The real question isn't whether Maduro will fall, it's whether the US is willing to do what it takes to make him fall, or whether it's prepared to live with the consequences if he doesn't. One thing is, the Sabalo incident wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening act. And if the US doesn't start thinking seriously about how to counter Maduro's strategy, the next act could be a lot more dangerous. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of US grand strategy in Latin America. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional covert operation would be enough to keep the region in line. But Maduro's submarine stunt is a symptom of something far more: the erosion of American deterrence. And when deterrence erodes, the world's revisionist powers, Russia, China, Iran, start testing the limits. Let me explain why this matters. The USS Gerald, our fort, isn't just a ship, it's a floating symbol of US power projection. When a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, likely a Russian-made Kilo-class or a Chinese-built Type 039, gets close enough to shadow it, that's not just a tactical provocation, it's a strategic message. It says, we can challenge you in your own backyard, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the worst part? They're right. The US has no good options here. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's response to the Sabalo incident was weak because it had to be. The White House issued a stern statement, the Pentagon scrambled some F-16s for a show of force, and then, nothing. No sanctions action, no cyber retaliation, no kinetic response. Why? Because the US is already stretched thin. Ukraine is burning through artillery shells faster than American factories can produce them. Taiwan is bracing for a Chinese blockade. The Middle East is a powder keg waiting for the next spark. And in the middle of all this, Venezuela, a country with a GDP smaller than Connecticut's, is poking the US Navy with a stick. Now, some in Washington will argue that this is just Maduro being Maduro, that he's a desperate man clinging to power, that he's not a real threat. But that's exactly how miscalculations happen. In 1982, Argentina's junta invaded the Falklands because they assumed Britain wouldn't fight back. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait because he thought the US wouldn't care. In 2022, Putin invaded Ukraine because he believed NATO was too divided to respond. Every time, the aggressor misreads the defender's resolve. And every time, the result is war. So what are America's options? Let's break them down. First, there's the status quo: more sanctions, more diplomatic pressure, more rhetoric about democracy. This is the path of least resistance, and it's the one the Biden administration is on. The problem? It hasn't worked in 6 years, and there's no reason to think it'll work now. Sanctions have devastated Venezuela's economy, but they've also entrenched Maduro's regime by forcing him to rely on Russia, China, and Iran for survival. The more isolated he gets, the more he turns to America's adversaries. It's a self-defeating cycle. Second, there's negotiation, a deal where Maduro gets sanctions relief in exchange for elections, the release of political prisoners, or some other concession. This is the path the Obama administration tried in 2015 with Cuba, and it's the path some in the State Department are quietly pushing now. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. Every time the US has offered him a way out, whether it was the 2019 Oslo talks or the 2023 Barbados Agreement, he's used the breathing room to consolidate power. And let's be, if the US lifts sanctions without real reforms, it'll look like capitulation. That's a non-starter in an election year. Third, there's escalation, a surgical strike on Venezuelan military assets, a cyber attack on PDVSA's oil infrastructure, or even a limited naval blockade. This is the path that hawks in Congress and the Pentagon whisper about. The problem? It's a slippery slope. A single airstrike on a Venezuelan radar station could spiral into a full-blown conflict. And unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, Venezuela has powerful allies. Russia has already warned that any US military action would be met with a response. China, which holds billions in Venezuelan debt, would see it as a direct challenge to its interests. And Iran, which has been deepening its ties with Caracas, could retaliate asymmetrically through Hezbollah in Latin America, through cyber attacks, or through attacks on US personnel in the Middle East. Fourth, there's containment, accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focusing on limiting his influence. This is the cold, realist approach. The US could work with Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana to counter Venezuelan aggression, while quietly encouraging internal opposition to chip away at Maduro's power. The problem? It's slow, it's messy, and it requires patience, a commodity in short supply in Washington. It also means admitting that the US can't fix every problem, which is politically toxic in an era of American decline anxiety. So which path should the US take? None of them, at least not in isolation. The real answer is a grand strategy reset, one that recognizes that Venezuela isn't just a problem to be solved, but a symptom of a larger crisis in US foreign policy. Here's what that looks like. First, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as an afterthought. For too long, Washington has viewed the region through the lens of migration, drugs, or great power competition, rather than as a strategic priority in its own right. That has to change. The US should be investing in infrastructure, energy, and technology partnerships with its neighbors, not just to counter China, but to rebuild trust. The Americas are the most natural economic and security partners the US has, yet trade with Latin America has stagnated while China's influence has surged. That's a self-inflicted wound. Second, the US needs to rethink its approach to sanctions. Right now, they're a blunt instrument that hurts ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. Instead of broad-based economic warfare, the US should target the specific networks that keep Maduro in power, his inner circle, the military officers who prop him up, the Russian and Iranian enablers. And it should couple sanctions with incentives. If Maduro wants sanctions relief, he should have to make real concessions, not just empty promises. Third, the US needs to rebuild its deterrence. That doesn't mean starting wars, it means making it clear that there are consequences for provocation. If another Venezuelan submarine gets too close to a US carrier, the response shouldn't be a strongly worded statement. It should be a show of force that leaves no doubt about American resolve. That could mean escorting Venezuelan ships out of international waters, jamming their communications, or even seizing a vessel. The goal isn't to start a conflict, it's to make Maduro think twice before testing the US again. Fourth, the US needs to work with its allies to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. That means pressuring the UN to take a harder line, convincing the EU to ex its own sanctions, and making it clear to Russia and China that their support for Maduro comes with a cost. Right now, Maduro is playing the great powers off each other, taking Russian weapons, Chinese loans, and Iranian oil while laughing at US sanctions. That game only works if the US lets it. Finally, the US needs to prepare for the long game. Maduro isn't going to fall tomorrow, next month, or even next year. But regimes like his are inherently unstable. The question isn't whether Venezuela will change, it's when and how. The US should be positioning itself to shape the change, rather than reacting to it. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about winning every battle. It's about setting the conditions for long-term success. The Sabalo incident wasn't just a close call, it was a wake-up call. The US can keep pretending that Venezuela is a manageable problem, or it can start treating it like the strategic challenge it is. The choice is Washington's. But history won't wait forever.